what we do. My name is Ram. So after working for most leading companies in the banking, financial services, insurance space for over 10 years, I decided to set up shop in early 2018. In most part of 2018, I worked as a corporate trainer, only to be again drawn into the world of financial services. Anita, who is a co-founder at MoneyStream, is a mindset coach. So she's on the call. Hi. Yes. And she runs her own firm by the name The MindStream. Okay, so we are siblings. Both of us firmly believe that to live life by design, you need to have both mind and money in the right place. Yeah, so quickly moving on to what we do. So we fancy ourselves as a multi-asset advisory and distribution business, encompassing equity, fixed income, and commodity. Of course, only gold. Recently, we have also forayed into real estate and like to make some inroads there as well. So that's pretty much about us. So moving on to the session today, our guest speaker Nilesh Shah needs no introduction. He is one of the leading portfolio managers in the country. He is the managing director and CEO of Envision Capital, which has over a decade of operations behind it right now. Envision offers a single strategy of value investing in Indian stocks. So I think I'll let Nilesh talk more about it later. Prior to starting Envision, Nilesh has been the president of Kotak Asset Management, so where he has led the investment team and had been responsible for managing, advising about over $1 billion of equity assets. So we would like to welcome Nilesh to the webinar today and thank him for being with us today. Thank you, Nilesh. Yeah. So I believe what you'll hear from Nilesh is pure and unadulterated equity commentary today.
Okay.
Hopefully some of this to make us rich.
So in addition to his views about Indian markets and economy in the current situation, he will also touch upon his house outlook over the medium to long term. So without further ado, Nilesh, it's over to you. The floor is yours, and we are all eager to wait to hear from you.
Great, Ram. A very good morning to all of you, all the participants. Anita, great to meet you over this call as well.
Pleasure.
And I'm honestly intrigued by the kind of names you've come up for your ventures. Money, mind, I couldn't agree anything more on it. Wish I had thought of something similar in terms of my names, but great to be with you, all of you, on a Saturday morning. Thanks for taking the time out on a weekend. And to begin with, I hope each one of you are fine along with your dear and near ones. Stay safe, stay healthy. That's honestly becoming now pretty much like the statutory warning that you would want to give out on any webinar or any interaction. So folks, on that note, once again, great to be with all of you all, and I hope we can kind of spend the next few minutes. I'll probably try and speak over the next 5 to 10 minutes in terms of what I think about the post-COVID world. What is COVID, etc. I don't think I need to spend any time on that. Maybe each one of us is as well informed. And I would not definitely try to pretend that I'm an epidemiologist. So to that extent, I'd probably talk about the post-COVID world. Truly challenging times, unprecedented times. I have never seen this kind of a time in my lifetime. It's probably the most challenging times. I think clearly I would not mince words in saying that the economic outlook truly is uncertain. It is very challenging. And it's going to take us some time to basically be able to kind of come out of this a pit that we find ourselves in. But I'd probably say that the gloom and doom ends here. And I clearly believe that truly we are heading into way better times going forward. And why do I think that this be the case? First and foremost, I think we have to be very clear that India's economy and growth was on already a relatively softer kind of a patch even before COVID. COVID has only basically in a way done two things. It has in a way aggravated the kind of status that we were in, but I think in a way it has made everybody far more attuned and agile to the need for basically doing something very, very dramatic. And I think it's very heartening to know that I think the government and the policymakers have begun to realize this. Globally, of course, there has been massive infusion of liquidity. The US Fed again has basically been leading the pack. It's like the Pied Piper pretty much. And I think most central banks world over have responded extremely well. I think it's commendable in terms of what the Reserve Bank of India itself has done. I think the most dramatic impact of all of this is that we have record low interest rates. The biggest challenge for corporate India has been cost of capital, and I think we are in unprecedented times in terms of lower cost of capital. Of course, there is still room for interest rates to come down given the fact that we are looking at a pretty benign inflationary outlook. So to that extent, interest rates have still more room to fall, but nevertheless, I think single-digit interest rates for firms, I think is a huge outcome. Number one. Number two, I think the crash of crude. The crash of crude clearly benefits India in a significant manner. Doesn't matter whether it is you and I as citizens of the country benefit or whether it's the government of India benefits. Either it's basically going to leave more money in my wallet or it's going to leave more money in the wallets of the government. But I think net India as a country, as an economy benefits. Number two. Number three, I think the big positive essentially is that the winds are turning, the winds are changing. China plus one is essentially becoming now the theme. Global companies are looking at alternative investment destinations to set up their manufacturing bases. Of course, so far the big beneficiaries of this trend have been countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, and all of that. But I clearly believe that India has a strong chance. Of course, we can't be kind of just waiting, saying somebody's going to come. We will have to basically welcome them with both our hands, embrace them, and make the environment and the climate pretty benign for being able to attract a lot of investment, be it private investment, be it foreign direct investment. Companies like Boeing, Apple, etc. have already drawn up huge plans to kind of come into India directly and set up manufacturing bases. Some of the tax reforms over the past several years, which is either the introduction of the GST or lowering corporate tax rates to record lows of 15% for manufacturing companies, I think has essentially been a very, very strong starting point. And now there seems to be some bit of competitiveness amongst each one of our states within the country to kind of attract foreign investment by amending their land laws, labor laws, making clearances more faster, and all of that. And of course, there are some states like UP, Karnataka, which seem to be essentially wanting to take the lead, and of course, compelling other states to basically join course. In addition to that, clearly believe that with low interest rates, better tax laws, and the fact that sovereign wealth funds, if they invest into infrastructure projects, they will enjoy tax-free returns. This was announced in the last union budget. Again, I think is basically going to be contributing a lot to kickstarting the investment cycle in India. So I think these are some of the big trends that I see. But I think more importantly, some of the other big trends which I see, which have been around for a while, and I think which will only gather momentum. Number one, essentially, is the financialization of the economy. Clearly, if you look at it, banking credit as a percentage of GDP is almost 100% in the United States. It's almost 300% in China, but it's as low as 50% in India. That number is going to go up dramatically. And I think that itself is going to become a big source of growth for India, number one. Number two, after financialization is basically formalization of the economy. I clearly believe that if you really look at it, India has 63 million individual enterprises, okay? And of these, there are only 20,000 companies which have a paid-up capital of more than 10 crores. Now, juxtapose this to the United States. The United States probably has less than 50 million enterprises. And this is for an economy which is 8 times our size. So you're going to see a lot of companies become now more formal, a lot of enterprises becoming formal, converting into companies and becoming way more larger. And I think when they become more formal, more larger, their ability to handle the society and handle the ecosystem, I think is phenomenal. I think when companies become more formal, more larger, I think the challenge that we faced in terms of migrant laborers, I think would have been a lot less. The ability to basically formal companies and larger companies to take care of their unorganized labor force and unskilled labor force, I think is significantly higher. So I think that's a very, very important trend. Third, urbanization. If I look at basically the United States and some of the other developed economies, urbanization is as high as 100%. In the case of some of our Asian neighbors like South Korea, China, that number is 60 to 80%. For India, that number is probably still about 30%. which means that you're going to see essentially a lot more urbanization happen, which is going to essentially spawn the demand for a lot of goods and services, and thereby basically lift our growth rates, or have the potential to lift our growth rates. The fourth is digitalization. I think that's a very, very powerful phenomenon. And I think what has been essentially in the news in a post-COVID world essentially is the ability of Jio to attract significant amount of foreign capital and to have a strategic partner like Facebook. Now, what this does is, one is to kind of look at it saying this is good for Reliance Industries, but I think what is happening is fantastic for India. And why I'm saying this, because the world has been able to successfully migrate from an industrial economy to essentially a digital economy. I think in case of India, that process had started but had yet to gather momentum because there wasn't a very strong digital platform which could essentially facilitate India's migration from an agrarian economy to basically a digital economy. And I think Jio is going to be able to do that, because what Jio already has is, of course, 400 million subscribers, a very powerful telecom infrastructure, a very powerful online infrastructure. And this will help thousands, lakhs, and millions of individual enterprises to be able to reach out to hundreds and millions of households which are waiting out there to basically have the best of products and services. And I think this is what Jio and the investment into Jio is going to do. So I think let us not underestimate or undermine the power and the impact of these huge, significant investments and strategic partnerships which Jio has been able to attract. I think this is going to be phenomenally positive for India. And the last part, of course, is the impact of infrastructure, manufacturing, and automation in different walks of our life. Of course, clearly with change in land laws, labor laws, GST, lower tax rates, better infrastructure, power sector reforms, I think that itself is going to basically bring in a lot of investments to manufacturing and infrastructure. But I think what is going to be very important is India's ability to adopt technology in even something as basic as not just public services, but even something as basic as agriculture. And the only way we can lift our basically incomes, because we have more than 50% of our population dependent on agriculture. And I think embracing technology in agriculture, and when I say technology, it's not just about going online and all of that. No, it's about improving or adopting high levels of mechanization to lift productivity, the ability of now farmers to sell anywhere in India. This was essentially again a reform which happened during the COVID times. It was part of one of those stimuluses which the finance minister has announced, that basically doing away with APMCs and giving farmers the ability to basically sell where they want. So I think we have different things which I think are helping us, be it our demographics, be it formalization, be it farm financialization, be it urbanization, be it digitalization, and be it more industrialization and mechanization. So I think a combination of all of this, to me, I think presents the most unprecedented and the unparalleled investment opportunity. Now, what all this means for each one of us as investors, because finally, I think each one of us is looking at income generation and wealth creation. And what I clearly believe is that our markets have come to a very, very interesting stage. And if we look at it right from 2014 to basically the start of 2020, I think our earnings growth has essentially been a lot less than what our potential has been. But basically what we have seen is a huge amount of PE expansion. I think what COVID has done is to basically kick in or set in a huge correction process. And so I think valuations have come off significantly. The kind of PE multiples which our companies were enjoying prior to COVID, I think, was significantly higher. And what we are now seeing basically is valuations coming off significantly. And I think we have to keep in mind, friends, that as investors, what is important is not just what we buy, but at the price at which we buy. And I think what we buy, by and large, of course, is relatively easier to kind of identify. But the price that we pay is essentially a function of how market forces behave. It's a function of liquidity and all of that. And I think that I am very excited about the prices at which a lot of the public market universe is trading at. And of course, there are, those very obvious 10, 20, 30 large caps, which are still trading at relatively expensive valuations. But if I were to basically subtract the top 10, 20, 30 companies out of this broad universe of maybe 300 companies, 400 companies, then I think that pretty much the rest of the 90% of the universe is trading at very, very attractive valuations. And I think that is something which one has to basically keep in mind. And I will just probably spend the next 2 or 3 minutes, and I'll end my session with that. Is that one is to, of course, look at headline valuation numbers, to look at basically things like price to book and all of that. And of course, we can share a lot of that data with you in terms of why India now, and how valuations are so attractive. But I'll just leave you with 2 or 3, 4 kinds of different companies which I think are very, very attractive. And I would probably want to flash back that when I started off Envision Capital in 2010, and we started managing our portfolios, and we started PMS activity, and I was seeing incredible value at that point of time. And when we had made investments then, we had invested in a company like 3M India at that point of time, and we saw that while the markets were too focused on the macros and saying the macros are bad, crude oil prices are rising, inflation is high, interest rates are high, and there is policy paralysis. But on the other hand, 3M India was trying to basically implement a very India-centric strategy of production and innovation and reaching out to consumers. And I think since then, 3M India has essentially ended up being one of the best wealth creators which have been there. Similarly, I think when we started off, we were looking at a company called Symphony, which was making air coolers, and Symphony was trading at 15, 18 times multiples. And since then, Symphony has grown almost at 20% CAGR. Its earnings remains a dominant player, and today its valuations are probably between 40 to 50 times. So this is essentially, so on one hand, over the last 7, 8, 9 years, earnings have grown probably 2 to 3x, and then of course re-rating has happened between 3 to 4x. So in the process, some of these companies have ended up being essentially, in a way, multi-baggers, so to say. And I see similar situation right now. And just to kind of think about it, for example, one of the most beaten down sectors today is the hospitality sector. Now, within that, there is a small cap company called Mahindra Holidays, which is part of the Mahindra and Mahindra group. Now, if I were to kind of look at the market cap of Mahindra Holidays, it is less than 2,000 crores. Friends, if you just look at basically its latest earnings results, on one of the slides on its presentation says it has 750 crores of cash, so it has no debt. 750 crores of cash, or it has no net debt. So it has 750 crores of cash, 1,500 crores of receivables, and more than 1,800 crores of value of real estate. So if I were to kind of add up all of this, this comes up to roughly about 4,000 crores. So as a global investor would say, that a company like Mahindra Holidays with no debt, excellent governance, strong pedigree, is available to you at 50 cents to $1. If in future, whenever business picks up, of course, you will see basically addition to the intrinsic value. But clearly, there is a lot of gap between the price at which it is trading at and what essentially is the intrinsic kind of value which is there. So I think clearly there is tremendous value. You look at a company like, say, a TTK Prestige. A company like TTK Prestige, which is into a leader in pressure cookers, is having kitchen appliances, and of course, business for a company like TTK Prestige should grow significantly going forward, because the whole tendency of work from home, learn from home, stay at home is catching on. And so, of course, people who are very keen on cooking and basically end up doing basic cooking every day want a better kitchen, they want better appliances. And I think a company like TTK Prestige, I think, stands to gain tremendously from what's happening around us. Again, it has no debt, good, very strong on governance. It has a pedigree of several decades. And just I'll leave a small statistic with you, that we in India have 250 million households. And the revenues of TTK Prestige are around between $250 million to $280 million, which means that products of TTK Prestige can probably be there in every home of India. And today, TTK Prestige broad revenues per household in India is just about $1, as low as $1. This number could be $3, $5, $10 over the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. So the runway of growth for a business like that is phenomenal. And keep in mind that it has been the government's priority to have a home for every Indian, to have a kitchen for every Indian home, to basically have electricity being supplied to every home, and to basically have cooking gas supply to every home. So every scheme of the government, be it Ujjwala or many of the other things, essentially only increase the market size for a company like TTK Prestige, which is a leader, which is strong on governance, no debt, market leader, and essentially having very high levels of growth and capital efficiency, and available at a price which is probably already off more than a third from the highs that it made maybe a year back or 2 years back. So these are some of the examples that I thought I would leave with you in terms of the kind of opportunities which is there in the marketplace. And we basically at Envision are exactly trying to do this. We are a lot more positive, more constructive in terms of what opportunities which are there in the broader market. This is really not the time to focus on the downsides of COVID or the downsides of a low growth. I think these are things which get addressed over a period of time. This is the time to go micro. This is the time to go bottom up and identify those kind of companies which I think are available at deep discount, deep value to what they could end up being over the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. I think in addition to that, there are many other sectors where we see tremendous amount of value. Technology is again a very strong area. Pharmaceuticals is again a very, very strong area where we see tremendous value. There is space like health, wellness, personal care, nutrition, which I think are going to enjoy very high growth rates as the consciousness around having a better health for yourself comes in. So I think there are companies which again are addressing that space as well. Companies like alcoholic beverages, again, where demand is going to be relatively resilient, COVID or no COVID, low growth rates or high growth rates. These are businesses which are going to be very robust, very resilient. And we think that there are fantastic homegrown leaders out there which are capital efficient, running light balance sheets, and have the ability to basically not just sustain, but basically innovate, grow, and essentially be several multiples times their current size from here over the next many years, over the medium to long term. So I think this is where I would basically leave it at in terms of what I think are the broad themes which are powering India, which will help India to become a much more better investment destination, how we think about markets and how we are thinking about individual sectors and what kind of individual opportunities which are there. So this is where I would probably kind of in a way end my monologue or my thoughts with. I will leave it to Ram and Anita to basically now take us forward in terms of how we make this more interactive, and I'll leave it there to them to basically navigate the rest of the session.
Sure. Thanks, Nilesh. Thanks for the overall a picture that you have painted actually of the entire situation today. Yes, it's very easy to look at the downside of the current situation, because that is what is usually spoken about. Be it on the media or be it in any circle. So I think what I hear you say is obviously that there are a lot of fundamental shifts that are happening in the country even before COVID came in. And that would have included, the financialization of your savings, or be it the digitalization of the economy, and some of the players who are actually leading the pack. And to that extent, what I also hear you say is that this is probably a time to not really look at the entire market or from a top-down approach, but look at individual companies who are not leveraged, probably who are balance sheets are strong. And I appreciate or respect you. You actually gave us some names, and that is actually some value addition for the viewers who are there. I think they could. I think in the first 15 minutes, 20 minutes of the session, I think you already have got your value, I believe. So yes, I think I really agree with you that probably we need to slide down the path and say that okay, everything is gloom and doom, but then there are opportunities here as well. However, people do. Are scared of fishing in troubled waters, because people have burnt their hands even earlier, because the kind of research, advice, and support which investor should have or work with is typically absent. So it's more on the hear and say, more of what you hear on media, which probably a retail investor or even a HNI investor to that extent is that piece is missing. So in such a scenario, when you say that yes, there are some of these companies which have low debt, maybe the capacity utilization is also, there is even enough room for them to kind of grow post-COVID world. How do you really look as an investor? How do you really look at a company and say, okay, these are the things in the balance sheet that if I look at, then I know that this is not a highly leveraged company. I know that these are companies which are probably having that room to grow when the situation improves. So I mean, I'm really going down to a little bit of a very micro thing, but then it would get the investors out here to now how do you look at the balance sheet, for example, would be
yes. Okay, fine, great. So there are Ram, I'll address this in two ways. That there are basically necessary conditions for a good investment, and there are sufficient conditions for a good investment. These are essentially the two platforms or the two constructs or the two frameworks on which I think every investor should look at. And when I say what are the necessary conditions, the necessary conditions, I call it as basically a BCG framework, which is balance sheet, cash flows, and governance. Okay. These three are essentially non-negotiables, which means that ideally the balance sheet should have essentially as little debt as possible. The business should be able to generate cash flows, and of course, there should be no red flags around governance. Now, what is governance? And I'll give you some, and I'll probably kind of talk about in terms of how I've seen governance. I think some of the prerequisites are that we are still in India, a lot of the businesses are family owned and family run. And I think what you need to see is that is there sufficient skin in the game, which means how large is the promoter holding? Is it too low? Is it too high? Okay. And obviously, I think over a period of time, I personally have gone towards companies where the promoter holding is relatively high. I'll give you an example that in 2008, for example, the company which went down under was Satyam. And the basic thing, if you had to look at it over a period of time, is that the promoter holding always remained low. And when the promoter holding is low, the incentive for them to basically align their interest with your interest as a minority shareholder is honestly not there. Whereas if the promoter holding is high, then of course there is an alignment of interest. So I think level of promoter holding, pledge of shareholding, I think these are some of the things which are very important. Related party transactions. These are some of the things that you should look out for in the annual report and see whether there are too many of these related party transactions. Is the management taking very high salaries, high compensation, and things of that kind. So I think that is one part of it. Then is to basically look on and get on to basically the business. That how strong is this business? Is this company a leader? Is it a challenger? Is it a laggard? Okay. And then two is, what basically are the growth prospects for this company? And I think that is very, very important. And I gave you, for example, an example of, what could be the potential for a business like TTK Prestige, saying is that, look, 250 million households in India and just $250 to $280 million of revenues. That itself, just $1 revenue per household, I think is an abysmally low number, which means that this business could potentially be several times what it is currently. Another example that I will give you, and I'll make this disclaimer that it's one of our portfolio companies, HDFC Asset Management Company, which runs India's largest or amongst largest mutual funds. And just some very simple statistics that we are a country of 1.3 billion people, and there are just less than 20 million unique mutual fund account numbers, which means that less than 2% of India's population has a mutual fund account, which means this number could be dramatically higher. If you look at mutual fund AUM as a percentage of our GDP, that number again is probably just about 10 to 12%. We are a $3 trillion economy almost, and our mutual fund AUM is roughly around $300 billion. Now that number can be dramatically higher. Even if I were to look at a country like South Africa, Brazil, that number is about 50 to 60%, which means that we have an economy which is growing. So that $3 trillion number is going to be way higher. And of course, if we kind of bridge this gap between 10% to 50% in terms of AUM as a percentage of GDP, then these businesses could again be 5 times, 10 times their current size, maybe in the next 10, 20 years. So I think what you have to assess essentially is the kind of business and what essentially are the growth prospects for a business like this. So these are some of the basic things which I think one needs to look at, and this is not any rocket science. This is just about keeping your eyes and ears open to looking around, look at the basic trends which are basically shaping the economy, and then figure out that where is basically what are the kind of businesses where the headroom for growth is phenomenal over the next many years. These are things which are not going to change in the next few months or in the next few quarters. These are trends which could take years. But keep in mind that when you think long term, when you think in terms of a multi-year or a multi-decade kind of a scenario, then that is where the doors of wealth creation open. By looking at the next few days, few weeks, few months, or few quarters, you are not going to basically be able to kind of think from a wealth creation perspective. You will probably just be kind of living by the day. But I think when you have to think very long term, you will have to look at how the prospects for an individual kind of business are. And I think that is where the big opportunity is in a fast growing emerging economy like India.
Sorry, yeah. So thanks for giving the BCG prism, because I think that is a clear, a clear lens for investors to look at a stock. You also mentioned earlier about the price that you pay, right? I mean, even if you were to kind of, get past the BCG lens and say that yes, and like you said, probably it's not rocket science. People, if you can keep your ears and eyes open, you see what is going on around you, and you know that there is opportunity for a whole host of things in a country like India. But the next thing that I think one comes to mind is that how do I know that if I'm giving the fair price, or I'm buying it at a fair price and not really buying an expensive stock? Because this is again is a mystery for people, and usually the to give an anecdotal evidence is that people just go by the chart and see which is a 52-week high, 52-week low. And okay, if it's anywhere near 52-week low, okay, you buy it. Or if it's in 52-week high, you kind of push it aside. So how does an investor really know what is a fair price to pay for a stock?
Great. So I think Ram, I think most investors, and I think including myself, especially initially on, we've always basically made the mistake of just kind of defining. Is to basically, I think the first starting point is to differentiate between price and the value. And when I say value, means what is the business worth, or what is the company worth, and what is the price you're paying for it. Now, one of the examples which I gave earlier on when I spoke about Mahindra Holidays, and one is to kind of say that value the business. Now, that can be a slightly more complicated process. But I think when there are some very basic ingredients available to you, that here is basically the value of fixed assets, here is the value of the receivables it has, which it is going to realize over the next 2-3 years, and here is the cash which it has. And the sum total of that basically comes to a particular X number. And versus that, what am I paying for it, which is essentially either the price or the market cap. And what we saw in the case of Mahindra Holidays is that using that parameter, it probably trades at a 50% discount to what it is trading at. Now, this, of course, is a very, very classical approach. And again, I would say that there's nothing right or wrong about it. It's all about the execution. Again, like the way in the world of cricket, and I'll draw an analogy that you could play 20-20, you could play a one-day match, you could play a test match. Okay, there's no right or wrong format about it. I think what makes the game very interesting are basically the players themselves. So it's for you individually to kind of evolve your own approach and make this whole experience interesting for you. So I gave the example of, say, Mahindra Holidays, where there is a deep discount to what the intrinsic value could be. And then you kind of go over to something like a growth stock. And I gave you an example of, say, an HDFC AMC or an HDFC mutual fund. And I think the starting point to basically kind of come up with is that what are the kind of returns I am expecting? And if that number is, say, 15%, I'm expecting a 15% return. The very useful starting point for you is to figure out that can the growth of that company or the business exceed my return expectations? Which means that the starting point is, if I'm expecting a 15% return, I figure out that can HDFC AMC's mutual fund business over the next 10 years, for example, grow at a rate exceeding 15%. Okay, and if the answer to that is yes, okay, then you know for a fact that you are staring at a reasonably sound investment proposition. Of course, the other criteria, which was the BCG framework, do come in. That is it kind of a low debt balance sheet? Does it score on on corporate governance? Does it have the cash flows? All of that. And I think a business like HDFC AMC fits that BCG framework. And now what you have to assess is that, can the mutual fund business in India grow at a rate exceeding your required rate of return over the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever is essentially your time frame? And if the answer to that is yes, the P multiple that you pay for it becomes less important. Okay, so obviously, of course, if you kind of buy it at a 15p multiple, then obviously it will end up being it will probably end up giving you a much higher return, because the average P multiples in India for a high quality business have always been north of 20 to 25 times. That is the kind of thing. So if you have a business which is growing at 15%, which means over the next 10 years that business is going to be 4x of what it is. And if you basically kind of say that, okay, fine, when it is available at 4x, and if I give it a 25p multiple, it's going to be worth 100, versus that, what is the price at which it is kind of available. So this is how you could kind of in a way figure out. So the first example which I gave you was a classic value stock, and the second example which I have given you of HDFC AMC is a classic growth stock, saying is that if the growth prospects exceed my return expectation, then this can end up being a reasonably good investment or a sound investment.
Nilesh, one more thing is that in the current scenario, is a P a good parameter to look at, or so many experts, we hear them say that probably price to book might be another indicator of how things are. And of course, then we hear about saying that all the classical methods of valuation in a scenario like this actually kind of are redundant. So in such a scenario, I mean, do you look at the price to book, or do you come with a whole new framework of looking at the valuation? So how has been your approach?
So initially, like when I started off, and my experience was, I used to of course look at price to book, and if a stock was at a discount to a book value, I probably thought it was a damn good investment. Okay, but over a period of time, I realized that the book value is nothing but just a culmination of the accounting practices which a company has followed over its existence. Okay, it's nothing beyond that. It's just a culmination of its accounting practices, and if it has been lucky to raise capital, that capital gets added to its net worth. Therefore, the book value expands. That is exactly typically what the banks have been doing. But believe me, over a period of time, I've realized that a price to book is essentially no indicator of the future value of a business. Now, I'll probably just, in a way, stop here, because what happens is that when we kind of talk about investing, we talk about markets and then we talk about individual investments. Now, when we talk about markets, I think price to book or price to earnings multiple is a reasonable indicator to look at. Okay, and that just gives you a sense of how the aggregate markets are trading at. Now, for example, when there is growth and it's a normal market, the P multiple can be a useful indicator to kind of provide you an indicator of how the overall market is. Okay, so when there are normal circumstances, when it is pre-COVID times, and when growth is normal, the P multiple becomes a useful indicator. But in an environment like this, and in an environment which can go on for the next 3 to 4 quarters, I mean, you have to keep in mind that FY 2021, if you are basically expecting growth from a company, I think your expectations are very high. You will have to essentially assume that FY 21 doesn't exist, and you will have to say FY 20 was 1 year, and FY 22 is the next year. So you will have to truly treat FY 21 as a COVID year. FY 20 is going to be pre-COVID year. FY 22 is going to be a post-COVID year. Assume, of course, by that time we find a cure. There is going to be medicine. There are going to be vaccines for COVID. Okay. So I think in such environment where earnings are uncertain, growth is uncertain, you can fall back upon price to book to kind of provide you a reasonable gauge in terms of how markets are trading at. Okay, so in normal times, you could say what is the long-term average P multiple and what are the current P multiples, and our market's trading at a premium or a discount. In an environment where there is no growth or degrowth, I think going back or falling back upon price to book would be a reasonable gauge to basically track. Okay, and that's essentially what happened with our markets in March and April, that our price to book essentially fell below long-term averages. Okay, and therefore you are seeing this kind of a bounce back. So basically a lot of investors have chosen to kind of look at price to book and says that yes, these are companies which will come back later, but in the interim I'm going to look at price to book. When it comes to individual companies, don't just look at price to book. Even in an environment like this, you will probably have to look at indicators like price to sales, because earnings are going to fall off a cliff. If your sales or revenues contract by even 10% because you run high operating costs, the impact on earnings is a lot more. The impact on profits is a lot more. So what you will probably have to look at, of course, you look at P multiple. You can look at price to sales, saying is here is a company 1,000 crores revenues and it is available to you only for 800 crores, or here is a company 5,000 crores revenue available to you for 3,000 crores. Okay, and so maybe you can say that okay, fine, earnings will come back from FY22 onward, but right now price to sales is a very, very useful indicator. I now go on to the third level, and I would probably put this for very, very sophisticated set of investors, where basically you go down to the power of cash flows. There is a saying, volumes are vanity, profits are sanity, cash flow the only reality. Okay, and you need to basically, if you are in a position to understand the cash flows of a company, arrive at the cash flows of a company, you can basically look at a company's cash flows for the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and discount those cash flows at a rate of return which you think is a reasonable rate of return. And if the present value of those cash flows exceed the price at which it is trading at, then of course you can say there is a strong margin of safety, and I am getting this stock at a discount to basically the cash flows which this company can generate over the next 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years, depending upon how long term your horizon is. So this is essentially the mix of different multiples, parameters or variables that you could have in your mind depending upon different market conditions and depending upon your own ability and aptitude to basically apply these variables to arrive at a valuation decision.
Sure, Nilesh. In fact, we had some questions coming in. I think one of the questions we have already addressed is that at this point in time, how do we look at companies? Do we look at their fundamentals or do we look at their growth prospects? I think you have pretty much answered that in some ways. I think there is another question which says that okay, what is actually low? What is the low for Nifty? So we are right now seeing from 7,500 to going to 10,000. So so it's like many of us are already feeling that we have missed the bus. But then there is another school of thought which says that much of this has been driven by the liquidity, liquidity created by the central banks. And yesterday I was listening to some commentary which says that the Fed is like the central bank of the world, and the kind of liquidity that they are pumping in, obviously that is what is driving markets across the globe. So have we really missed the bus? I mean, of course, I know it's probably I don't want to push you to a corner and say to forecast whether it's going to come down again. But then I think that is a question most investors have, that at the current levels, is it a good? Are these good levels to get in, or again are they inflated? Do we wait for another correction? So your thoughts.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's a very interesting kind of a question and a very, very interesting dilemma for most investors. The FOMO effect is always there, the fear of missing out and all of that. That always plays, and these are all behavioral kind of traits which we as individuals always have within us. And I think in the very long term, it's a very, and I'd probably kind of go a little tangential and say that you as an investor can always have three sources of basically your three sources of your edge or your power. One is your ability to look at information, or your ability to have the information. The second is what I call as basically the analytical edge, or what is normally called. as the analytical edge, which means your ability to process this information. And the third is basically to kind of have the behavioral edge, which means that do you have the ability to basically be more unbiased, be more objective, and to look at things very differently. So when there is basically a boom times, we all tend to basically say it's only going to get better. And when there are gloom times or doom times, we say that it's only going to get worse. And I think in these kind of times, in times of excesses, it is your behavioral edge which really comes out. Okay. And so to that extent, I think that my view is that every investor needs to have his own framework. What is the kind of allocation that he wants to do to equities? Okay. And somebody like Buffett has always been saying that you don't basically put both your feet in water every time. If you want to test the waters, first test it with one foot. Okay. And so I think you can never say I don't want any exposure, and neither can you ever say that I want to be 100% invested. Okay. And this answer is always in hindsight. In hindsight, everything is 2020. But what I probably think is likely to happen is that what matters in this market essentially is earnings. Okay. And my own view is that if you have missed the bus so far, I don't think you need to regret. This market for the rest of 2020 could potentially give you a lot of opportunities. Okay. Because the earnings outlook is not necessarily very, very strong or very resilient. I think the June quarter is going to be terrible. The September quarter is going to be bad, but may not be as terrible as the June quarter. And I definitely see a rebound starting from this H2 of this financial year. But how strong the rebound is going to be, I don't know. Will it make up for FY20, or the shortfalls of H1 of FY21? I again don't know. But broadly, FY21 is going to be a lot lower versus FY20, and FY22 is when basically the earnings will kick back. So my view is that if that calendar year 2020 will give you again a great entry opportunity. Will that entry opportunity be as attractive as what the lows of March were? I don't know. Maybe for some of the larger banks, it could be larger stocks, especially some of the banks, as a lot of concerns around asset quality come up. Yes, they could face a lot of selling pressure, but could it be the lows of March that they will come? I'm not quite sure. Okay, so at this stage, I would probably say that the 7,500 we saw on the Nifty, I think is pretty much the kind of lows. It would require a massive catastrophic event for those lows to break, okay, of 7,500. And I think, so one has to be cognizant of that. But I think the broader market, and I go back to what I had said initially, that leave out the top 10, top 20, top 30 companies. Leave that out, okay? There are the next 100, next 200, next 300 companies, which I think present a far more attractive opportunity, okay? And I don't see those kind of stocks posing tremendous downside, okay? And I think one has to be more constructive about that. In any sector, maybe just leave out the top 1 or 2 names, but the number 3, number 4, number 5 guys, I think have kind of pretty much bombed out, and they present an incredible opportunity for you to kind of invest over the next 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. I think in hindsight, whether you invested in 2001, 2002, it didn't matter. Okay, as long as you were there in the market between 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, you made tremendous amount of money between 2004 and 2007. Similarly, again, 2008, 2000, if you missed 2008, 2009, again gave you back that opportunity. And if you invested in 2009, by 2015, 2016, again, you would have made a lot of money. Similarly, 2013, whether you invested in 2013, 2014, didn't matter too much. Yes, it made the difference between you making 15% return and you making 25% return. But 15% return again is still inflation beating returns. That's very, very important. So I don't think that you need to focus now too much on timing. Best is have your set of stocks or have your set of funds or have your set of portfolio managers with whom you want to allocate money, or stocks to which you want to allocate money. Be there with them. Maybe you can decide to kind of put in 50% now, and if Mr. Market offers you the opportunity sometime during the course of 2020 or early 2021, be ready to top up with those funds, with those portfolio managers, or with those stocks. That's the way I would address it.
Sure. So the couple of things what I hear you say is that one, look beyond the large cap. That is a clear messaging, and even within the mid cap space, probably don't obviously go for the top ones only, because you're saying the top 2 or 3 companies, whether it's across cap, caps, you're saying that they are always on everybody's radar. Probably they are the ones there which are trading at an expensive valuation. So go beyond the top 10, top 15 in large cap, maybe go beyond the top 5 in the mid cap, and that is the way to look at it. That's one of the things.
Yes, and I'll just kind of add to that just to kind of look at that, there are basically, and I'll tell you where we are focused, that there are, of course, the top 100 companies which are the large cap companies. The next 150 companies are the mid cap companies. So there is this universe of 250 companies. Okay, and from this universe of this 250 companies, maybe if you kind of in a way just strip out the top 10% also, okay, you have the rest 90%, which is the 225 companies, and from those 225 companies, what one has to do is to just pick the 10, 15, 20, 25 best ideas and put a portfolio around that. The idea is not to eliminate large caps, because when I look at, say, an HDFC, AMC, or an ICICI, Lombard, General Insurance, these are leaders, these are large caps, but these businesses are still very nascent. These are not mature businesses. So unlike, say, a banking business which is very mature, unlike a business of soaps and shampoos which is very mature, unlike a business like paints which is very mature, okay, there are, even in large caps, there are a lot of emerging nascent businesses which have tremendous headroom for growth. So look out for those kind of names as well, which could be also from the large caps. Okay. So I would probably say that have a more multi-cap approach, have an approach which is identifying emerging businesses and some of those high growth businesses which can not just grow in single digits but can grow in double digits for the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And if you do that, you would automatically probably increase your chances of having double-digit returns from equities.
Sure. So moving on to a little bit of sectoral talk. So of course, the one sector which of course finds a lot of press and which obviously has a great weightage on the index as well is the banking and the financial space. Yes. Right. So with the current moratorium, and there are various figures doing the rounds as to what percentage of the total credit book of be it the entire industry or be it of a particular bank, whether it's a tier 1 bank or a tier 2 bank. So one is unable to fathom the percentage of credit that is there under the moratorium and how much of that is going to go bad probably. And then as a result of that, how are these stocks looking? So what's your take on that sector?
Yeah, so I think, the basic rules of banking remain the same. And basically keep in mind, and this is essentially what even Uday Kotak very recently say, and I have tremendous amount of respect for him. All of us have tremendous respect, but I've had the privilege of working at Kotak for a very long period of time. But what did he say? That typically the key to banking essentially is to think of you as an intermediary between depositors and lenders. So you are in the margin spread business. You make 2%, 3%, 4% spread, and you are putting to risk 100 rupees. And in the process only earning 2, 3, 4. So I think the key thing in banking essentially is asset quality. Okay, and I would still think that look for only those banks which were good on asset quality even before COVID happened. Okay, asset quality is not something around saying, okay, fine, you've now woken up from COVID and suddenly say, now I'm going to improve my asset quality. It doesn't work that way. Asset quality is all about DNA of the bank. You can get your asset quality right only if you have been pricing in the risk, assessing the risk and pricing that risk consistently well over last 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 25 years. It is not something suddenly you say, oh, I want to lose my weight and therefore I'm going to basically lose my weight in 24 hours. No, it is something which you should have been doing consistently, where you should have been exercising, you should have been having the right diet, you should have had the right way to kind of think properly, like the venture with Manisha Anita leads, which is basically, your whole mind game. So the right diet, right mind, all of that matters, and banking is pretty much like that. And I think we all know that which are the kind of banks which have been solid on asset quality. And I think, for example, we have been owning HDFC Bank. We like HDFC Bank. We love its focus on asset quality, its obsession with capital efficiency, sustaining high ROEs, its focus on fee-based income, it's focused on low-cost deposits through CASA. This is a DNA which I think the bank has built very well over the last 25 years. Okay, so I think he just focused on a bank like that and make the most of the volatility which is going to come in. Banking is not going to give you linear returns. It's going to be very volatile for the rest of 2020 and maybe even early 2021. And I think that is where you will be able to buy into a stock like HDFC Bank at very attractive prices. I mean, HDFC Bank always enjoyed P multiples of around north of 25 times. P multiples, I'm not using the word price to book, but P multiples. And today, HDFC Bank is probably available to you at a P multiple of maybe 16, 17 times its current year earnings. So if at all, here I would want to make a caveat that be with the best, be with the largest. HDFC Bank is the largest, so I think a bank like HDFC Bank makes a lot of sense. If you look at, I think those comparison tables are available in public domain, that I think the percentage of moratorium loans or the percentage of books which is under moratorium, I think is still, amongst the lowest for HDFC Bank, and that speaks volumes about the quality of that.
Nilesh, I just want to take a rain check with the questions that have been coming in.
Yes,
so,
please.
Jagdish, of course, I believe your question must be answered, as in whether you look at the fundamentals or you look at the future prospect. Nilesh, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're probably saying, of course, look at a balance of both. But when you're looking at future prospect, make sure you do it for a post-COVID situation, because looking very immediate might be a little too ambitious, right? So Jagdish, hope that answers. Jagdish, you've also asked about different sectors. Nilesh did mention a lot about it. He spoke about pharma, he spoke about nutrition, wellness, healthcare as some of the sectors. I'll allow him to add to that if he wishes. But coming to the next question, Satish, your question, lowest Nifty level. I think Nilesh has given some ballpark about the previous 7,500 being the similar status. Shiv, outlook on banking sector, although you've not mentioned whether it is to do with lending or an overall perspective, but I believe Nilesh has shared a very, very important thing with regards to here staying with these stalwarts rather than taking an unnecessary risk, which is different from what he told for overall stock allocation, where he said look for dark horses and also combine it with some safe and market leaders. So that brings me to Kamath, and Bhai, then I'll again let you take over. Kamath is asking, with government stimulus lower than market expectations and the number of COVID cases growing, what's driving the market higher?
Right, great. So I think in the very short term, what is driving the market higher is purely liquidity, and this is not just about domestic liquidity. This is also about foreign liquidity. And if you would notice in the last few sessions, number one, I think FIIs have turned net buyers, the FPIs. And I think therefore there is basically liquidity. And I'll just probably step back and say that at any point of time or at all points of time, there are three broad factors which determine, market movements: liquidity, earnings, and valuations. Okay, and I think liquidity continues to be very strong. Okay, both international liquidity as well as domestic liquidity, and we ourselves are seeing a lot of interest from prospective investors and our existing investors wanting to basically put more money into our portfolio products that we have. So I think liquidity is strong. Number two is valuations. As I was telling you, is that the valuations have turned very, very attractive, and there are a lot of people who just look at headline valuations and saying that, look, I think in the very long term, India is an incredible growth story and the valuations look very attractive, and I think therefore valuations are going up. I think most of the smart money is right now not focusing on FY21 earnings, and it's already shifted post to FY22 and beyond that. Let's look beyond COVID. Let's not just be obsessed and be traumatized by COVID in terms of our investment decisions. Of course, personally, from a health point of view, we need to be obsessed about COVID, but I think in terms of health matters, it's time to move on from COVID and look beyond kind of COVID. So I think these are some of the factors which essentially have been driving the markets. Now, coming to your question about stimulus, look, I mean, I think it's pointless trying to compare our stimulus program versus the stimulus of the Wild West. The Wild West has basically got the reserve currency, and they have the ability to print dollars, and there's global appetite for dollars, and therefore they can kind of, in a way, print their way to basically prosperity. I don't think that's an option which is available for India. I think if we kind of go down that path of fiscal expansion right now, I think that could probably do more harm to us than do good to us, because I think we run the risk of downgrades and things of that kind. And I think we may do a fiscal stimulus now. We exactly did a fiscal stimulus in 2008-9, but we couldn't exit that fiscal stimulus. And I think we were very happy by doing that fiscal stimulus, and we didn't take a lot of tough decisions around structural reforms. And I think what is very important for India right now is to kind of do something which is structural rather than to do something which is around stimulus. So I think I would still weigh more towards the structural part rather than the stimulus part. And I think it's very, very important that the government, well, a lot of state governments have been trying to kind of do a lot of structural stuff, but I think it's high time that India kind of gets even more bolder and does, undertakes a lot more other bolder structural reforms rather than just to kind of get into the race of having a stimulus which is calculated at just a percentage of GDP, and who knows, what those GDP numbers are going to be and what those stimulus numbers actually mean. So I think I would attach a lot more importance to the structural part rather than the stimulus part. And of course, the markets right now are a lot more getting driven by liquidity, and of course, the fact that valuations have become attractive.
Nilesh, just a question with regards to if liquidity is driving the market, then thankfully will the banks be opening up their lending a little more freely? Because, with festivals around the corner, right from Ganesh Chaturthi and then Diwali, from a quality of life point of view and avoiding, say, public transport, I will want to probably, buy a better car or buy a home. So will we see the purse of the banks loosening a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. I think the H2, what is basically going to drive our growth back and what is going to basically get, business growth and earnings back essentially is that life will become a lot more normal. Economic activity will become a lot more normal. People are going to again get back into buying cars, buying homes, buying appliances, and all of that. And keep in mind that today the challenge for banks is not liquidity. They have enough of liquidity, which is getting reflected in basically lower fixed deposit rates, which is there, and all of that. And the banks themselves are basically getting into repo and lending to the RBI and parking the money with them. So the banks have tremendous amount of liquidity. It's just that things have to get a lot more normal. Economic activity has to come back to normalcy, and all of that. And I think that is something which is already starting to happen. May was better than April. June is looking better than May, and then of course it looks like that progressively July, August, September should be better than what April, May, June have been. And the good part is that traditionally July to September has been a lean season for India because it's the monsoon season and all of that. Once September crosses, we get back into the festival season, we get back into the marriage season. A lot of migrant labor will come back, manufacturing will hopefully be back to normal. So I'm actually pinning a lot of homes, and I'm very positive and very optimistic that our H2 will be very, very different and very much more better than what our H1 is right now. And that's when I think the banks who are sitting on a lot of liquidity will step in and lend to people that they think are eligible and are creditable.
Okay. Just talking about H1, H2, first half, second half, Satish Mudgal is asking, should we look at stocks long term or short term? I'm really tempted to say, firstly, I think the definition of short term and long term has become a little different now. So your thoughts on that?
Okay, so I think never look at short term. Okay. never look at short term. Don't be a trader. Don't be a slave of prices. Don't essentially be a slave to the market, because the moment you start looking at short term, you will start looking at stock prices, and when you start looking at stock prices, you're going to look at investments as gambling and as a casino, and not essentially as a place to kind of make wealth. Wealth is not going to get created overnight unless you are terribly lucky or you've bought a lottery ticket. But otherwise, what is basically very, very important in the world of markets is essentially to kind of have an investment mindset. And an investment mindset, the prerequisite for an investment mindset is to think long term, think of stocks as businesses, think of how this stock can be an excellent company, and it will be an excellent company as long as it is sitting on a business and doing business which has tremendous growth prospects in the very long term. So I think clearly have a binary approach, think long term, and there is nothing else beyond long term.
Sure, Nilesh. So you run a concentrated portfolio, right? So just would like to hear a little bit more about your conviction on the how you go about doing your portfolio construction. Of course, I think that most of the talk that we have had actually has revolved around that. But what are some of the because we also hear about risks of a concentrated portfolio. So where does this conviction come from? What is the framework that you use for your own instance?
Yeah, great. So I think I think the biggest source of risk is to not know what you're doing, not doing your homework, not knowing where you've invested. And I think, that has essentially been kind of the source of risk. Source is nothing but permanent loss of capital and should be differentiated from stock price movements, which essentially, of course, are a source of volatility. So that's the big difference. So I think investors should be very, very clear that risk and volatility are two different things. Risk is permanent loss of capital. Volatility is daily fluctuations in stock prices. If you buy a bad business, that is the source of risk. But if you buy a good business, it would be either not risky or it would be less risky. But yes, it could still be volatile because there are fluctuations in stock prices. So again, I'm saying is that investing into a HDFC Bank or investing into an HDFC AMC or investing into an ICICI Lombard General Insurance, these are great businesses and they are unlikely to be risky, and therefore in a way you've eliminated or reduced your risk or mitigated your risk significantly by investing into a high quality business. But have their prices been volatile in the last 3 months or last 6 months? Yes, but that has not led to a permanent destruction of capital. So this is essentially the fundamental premise that we start off as portfolio managers, and we think that it's always very, very important to basically have essentially a philosophy which invests only into high quality businesses. High quality businesses defined as basically companies with sound balance sheets, generating cash flows, and having essentially no issues or less issues with governance. And that is where I come back to the original BCG kind of a framework. Now, why run a concentrated portfolio is because we know that quality in any walk of life is essentially always rare. You always have very limited number of quality players. So when you kind of having a cricket team, you just have 11 players and then you have another 5-6 players as a backup. So even if you look at just borrowing from basically the world of sports, a damn good cricket team, the total number of players in the team would always be in high teens, okay, mid to high teens. And if you look at any business, it's only the top 3, 4, 5 companies which kind of emerge to be long-term winners. So I think it's pretty much a similar situation with a portfolio, that I think when you have a portfolio of 15 to 20 stocks, I think these are essentially the kind of high quality winners, and therefore I would call this more a focused approach rather than just a concentrated approach. So I think our philosophy has been to own a portfolio of concentrated, high focused companies which stand for quality with tremendous growth prospects, and I think we would want to buy these at a reasonable price. And I think the way we also go about doing all of this, Ram, is to kind of ensure that we don't kind of put the money to work overnight. So if somebody kind of invests in our PMS, in our portfolio products, we don't basically go out there and invest on day one. We kind of take maybe a few weeks, a few number of days, or maybe even a couple of months to build a portfolio, because we want to kind of, as I said, that paying the right price also determines your returns over the next maybe 3 years or next 5 years. Maybe over the next 10, 20 years, it may not make material difference, but I think over the next 3 years, 5 years, I think it makes sense to kind of also be cognizant about the price you pay for a business. So buy a high quality business at a reasonable price. So we tend to kind of buy into 15 to 20 stocks, which I think is reasonably diversified. It's focused and reasonably diversified. It may not be as diversified like owning 50, 60 stocks, but when you own 50, 60, 80 stocks, you're not following a bottom-up approach. You are just basically either hugging a benchmark and saying that, okay, fine, I need to be overweight, underweight, and you may probably not have the best of understanding of those companies. But when you have 15, 20 stocks, it gives you the power to do quality homework as well. And that, I think, is basically the source of our conviction. And I think that is also the way we try to eliminate risk, by having a very deep understanding and a conviction of the kind of individual companies that we own.
Just as a side information for all the participants, because of course Nilesh is a portfolio manager and Envision is a portfolio management service provider. So PMS in India essentially is a investment management service that is available for investors, and SEBI recently has tweaked the guidelines to it, wherein investors who are investing a minimum of 5 million, that is 50 lakh rupees and above, are the investors who are eligible to sign up for a PMS service. And Nilesh and Envision have been actually a front runner in that space for a pretty long time. So that is just as a side information for the participants. So moving on, Nilesh, I know of course we have kind of clocked an hour, but just a couple of more questions and then I think probably we'll wrap it up. So talking about some of the ratings that have come in, right, from Moody's and the sovereign rating that we speak about, because that kind of gives a very negative feel. Whether those ratings really matter or not is another debatable question probably. But then because when people hear that, okay, India is next to junk, and then so what are we talking? So where is India headed? And to add to the gloom, all these ratings don't help. So what, in your perspective, how much weightage should we really give to news like this?
I probably think that don't give any weightage to these kind of sovereign ratings, country ratings, and things of that kind. Okay, I think, and in fact, honestly, I've lost count of who basically downgraded India recently and who essentially maintains a rating. But I think one of them basically downgraded, and those guys had actually upgraded in late 2017. Okay, and they were wrong then. Okay, and now they've gone and actually corrected their mistake, and they have basically downgraded back. So they have brought it back to where they had actually rated India in 2017. The other rating agency, which has reaffirmed their rating, had actually kept the rating constant in 2017. So therefore, they have continued to reaffirm their rating. So the previous rating agency, which had downgraded India, essentially only corrected their own mistake. Number one. Number two is that we still remain within the investment grade. So we have not, by a downgrade doesn't mean that you now become a junk country or a junk investment destination. India still remains in that investment grade rating. So that's it. So only within the investment grade, we have just moved down by one notch, and that too by one rating agency. Okay, so still India remains a very, very solid kind of an investment candidate as defined by some of these global rating agencies. The most important data point that I would want to share with you, and I can request Chaital to later on share this with you, Ram, which I think can be very useful for a lot of people who are worried about this rating. And I think the last time we were downgraded was sometime in 1997 or 1998. Okay, we have now got downgraded after 22 years. Okay, the last time India was downgraded in 1998, if you went ahead and invested the very next day into the Indian markets, which is either defined as Sensex or Nifty, I think in the subsequent 10 years, you actually made a 20% annualized compounded return. Okay, so that I think is the biggest proof or the testimony to how valuable a rating upgrade or a rating downgrade is for basically an equity investor. So we have to keep in mind that when we invest into equities, we are investing into individual companies. companies. Individual companies are run by individual entrepreneurs who are far more excited and far more passionate about growing their businesses. And what we have to, as equity investors, do is to identify the right companies, the high qualities, which are run by very strong, competent, sound, and passionate entrepreneurs. It is these guys who make the wealth, who create the wealth for us as investors. And what we have to do is to identify the right set of companies, the right businesses, and the right set of entrepreneurs running these businesses and running these companies.
Fair point, Nilesh. So a couple of questions again from participants. Of course, Nilesh is a equity asset patron, but still I think there is a question on gold. It says investing in gold -ETF. I don't know whether he's talking about gold ETF or gold separate, ETF separate. Is this a good time? I don't know, Nilesh. I mean, you'll have to probably say. All the sovereign gold bonds tranches opening up, I think there is quite a renewed interest in gold, and of course it touching quite high. Last month we saw gold rallying quite a bit. Yes.
Okay. So now, I think as an investor, the way I have learned investing, or I'm learning investing, is that you invest into something only which you can value. Okay, and equities, there is a way to value it because you're investing into companies which are running a business and which are generating profits, generating cash flows, and you basically put your return and you put your return expectations on that, and you say that, okay, fine, this is basically worth of this company. Okay. Similarly, when you're buying into a bond or a debenture or a government security or putting money with a bank FD, you know that this is the coupon rate which I'm earning on this fixed income. Okay. Similarly, when you are investing into a rental asset, let's assume that you own an office space of 5,000 square feet, and you say that, okay, fine, I'm paying so and so for this 5,000 square feet office on which I am earning rent, and this is going to be my return on investment. Okay. Gold remains an enigma. Okay. How do you value gold? Is gold the true value $1,800 or is it $800? Nobody knows, because nobody knows the earnings power of gold. Okay. So to that extent, it's almost impossible to have a fundamental view on gold. Okay. All that we know of is that gold as an asset class does well when there is tremendous amount of money printing which is being done, or it does well when there is a lot of fear with the real economy, and that is why it becomes a source of attracting liquidity. But beyond that, there is no other way to basically, in a way, value gold. And if you look at over the last maybe 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, I don't have data offhand, but gold price in dollar terms, okay, has, I think, underperformed the S&P 500, or it has underperformed the Dow Jones. Okay, that data is available. Okay, and I think that we as investors need to be very cognizant of that. In dollar terms, gold has underperformed. Now, gold has done well in rupee terms, or looks to have done well in rupee terms over the last 5 years, is because over the last 5 years, equities has underperformed. So gold, of course, is going to look stronger. But I think over 20 years, 30 years, I think gold has underperformed the Sensex. Okay, and we have to keep that in mind. The other thing we have to keep in mind, what have we done over these last 20 years? We as Indians, what have we done? We, in a way, have sold our best performing companies, okay, to foreigners, and the foreigners have sold their gold to us. This is essentially what has happened over the last 20 years. So what have we done? The foreigners have sold gold to us, and we have sold very well managed companies like HDFC Bank, and all of these companies to these foreigners. When I've said sold, is not you and me as individuals, but we as companies. They have come in and bought equities from us. So I think I am not a very big believer of gold, okay? But maybe because, gold does tend to do well in spurts, maybe it deserves some part of, position in your overall portfolio. Okay. So depending upon how you are, maybe out of 100 rupees, you have an X amount to basically equities, Y to fixed income, and maybe a Z portion to basically gold. And that depends upon you as an individual, how you want to allocate. So there is no way, I don't have any sense of how gold is going to behave, but yes, it's been performing reasonably well over the last 3 to 5 years, and therefore you may want to kind of have some bit of gold in your overall portfolio.
Sure, Nilesh, one more question is that if one were to stitch up a portfolio of, let's say, 10-15 companies today, which are the sectors you would say we need to? I know we have already touched upon a few sectors, but which are the top sectors that you would really look at if one were to stitch a portfolio of 10-15 companies?
So if it would be 10 to 15 companies, I think a lot of those companies would be around consumer as a sector and financials as a sector. Okay, and when I say consumer, it is not just about owning an HUL or a Nestle, owning the basic staple companies. For me, a company which is selling kitchen appliances, consumer appliances, is as much a consumer company as, say, an HUL is. A company which is basically selling alcoholic beverages is as much a consumer company as, say, what a company is selling soaps and shampoos is. For me, a company like Mahindra Holidays is a consumer kind of a company which is basically health, wellness, nutrition. So we own a company called Zydus Wellness. Now that is also a consumer company. So I would basically say that of the 15-20 companies, I would probably have about between 30 to 50% of my portfolio in these consumer companies. The next set of opportunities come around financials. Now, normally when people talk about financials, it's immediately to think about banks, but no, I think there is life beyond banks in the world of financials. I talked about how, owning a mutual fund business or a company like general insurance, health insurance, life insurance. This is also part of financials. So I think one would want to own that. Then there is basically the technology sector. I think India has a very large pool of talent and very well qualified engineers who have been coding for the world, and having companies around the world be more ready for a digital era. And there are some really very well run tier 2 technology services companies which I think have got kind of beaten down in this correction.
So just to interrupt here, Nilesh, so what you suggest is among the technology lot, you need to look beyond the usual suspects,
Yeah, so there is life beyond, Infosys,
TCS,
Wipro, and all of that, and then you go down to a lot of the tier 2 companies, and I think there is a tremendous value out there. We have been owning one of the L&T twins, which is there into technology services. So we've been owning L&T Technology Services as a company. I think they're doing tremendous amount of work around robotics, automation, Internet of Things, Industry 4.0. They work with a lot of leading manufacturing companies worldwide. They work with a lot of automotive aerospace companies worldwide to kind of get them to be digitally ready. So there are opportunities out there. There are some really top class manufacturing companies out there, and I think as you see the economy come back, you'd see some of these companies do very well. One of the companies that we own out there is a company called Carborundum Universal, which is part of the Murugappa Group. They are world leaders or leading world over in products like abrasives, refractories, ceramics, electro minerals. That's the space that they are in. They're almost a zero debt company, or probably now a zero debt company. Very reasonably priced. Stock price has come off. Pretty high on governance, part of the Murugappa Group. So that's basically, we own a cement company as well. And then of course, there are other pockets like pharmaceuticals, utility companies like city gas distribution companies, which are also kind of looking good. So I would probably say that there are broadly 5 or 6 pockets or sectors: consumers, financials. Third is to kind of look at export-oriented sectors like technology, pharmaceuticals out there. Then is to look out for companies which are around manufacturing and materials. So I gave examples of companies like Carborundum, a cement company, all of that, which are there, which are a play on the domestic kind of an economy. And then there are, of course, utilities which are into providing you and me very basic services. And they basically are into providing gas to our vehicles, to our homes, to our industries, to our offices, all of that. So I think, while you run a very focused portfolio of 15-20 companies, but you can build actually a very diversified set of sectors or diversified set of businesses which you can run by owning even 15 to 20 stocks.
Sure. I think one last question is again, I think when we are talking about sectors, your telecom and auto and real estate can't be very far behind. So
Yes.
a quick thought on some of these
Yeah.
sectors. Yes.
Yeah. So I think again these three are again very interesting sectors. Telecom, we spoke about what Jio has done, and if you are a mega cap investor and you're excited about what Jio is doing, Reliance of course can be a good option. I think Bharti Airtel again I think is a good option. I think the beauty about the telecom sector is that ARPUs are set to increase. They have been increasing I think since November of 2020. November of 2019, and they have been growing rapidly. And I think these are the two options which are there in telecom as a space. I think within auto, I'm more positive about owning the companies which make motorcycles and scooters. In post-COVID world, as people get more conscious, everybody would want to have a vehicle of their own. So I think I'm more positive about owning a Bajaj Auto or a Hero Honda. So my pecking order would be Bajaj Auto, Hero Honda, the way you look at it, followed by Maruti, and then followed by basically the companies which make trucks or the buses or the four-wheelers. That's the way out I look at it. I think also there are a couple of smart auto component companies which essentially get their revenues from OEMs, as well as from the replacement market, as well as from exports. That as a space has got beaten down, and I think over the next few months and the rest of 2020, that can become a very interesting kind of space. Real estate, I think home developers can become a very interesting place, because as we all are learning the art of working from home, learning from home, teaching from home, and all of that, or even socializing from home, I think everybody will now want to own slightly bigger homes, slightly more functional homes. So I think I'm more positive and constructive about owning a home developer rather than just owning a very generic real estate companies. We own one of the very good home developers in our portfolio as well. We are very positive about it. We think that this specific company has a land bank for the next 10 years in terms of, and so I think that makes it very efficient. Its ratings are really very good. Promoters own 74% of the company. It is relatively light in terms of its debt on the balance sheet. It probably has amongst the best practices. So yeah, I think we are positive about these sectors as well.
So may I ask if the developer is Bangalore based?
It has a very small share of its revenues from Bangalore, but I will leave you with a very sufficient clue that it derives a large portion of its business from Pune. So it is across Pune, Bangalore, and a bit in Mumbai.
Sure. Thanks for that, Nilesh. So Nilesh, I think we are pretty much done. So I would just like to kind of sum up what you have been telling, and obviously I'll leave the closing comments to you. So I think what Nilesh has spoken in the last hour or so is that yes, while essentially the scenario currently is that of gloom and doom, lot of negativity around, but yes, while we are taking care of ourselves at a personal level, being probably obsessed around how we move around and how we operate, but when it comes to investments, I think the rational part of our thinking, or the rational part of ourselves has to kind of take over, and then we have to, I think, learn to look at the world beyond the immediate year. In any which case, we are, I think, like Nilesh said, I think we have to roll out financial year 21 for most of our estimates, and we have to just look, the year beyond. Yes, of course, there are, and probably here I would again check with you, Nilesh. So, what could be the obvious risk, or not obvious risk? What could be the risk? Because as a advisor or a consultant, when people approach us, I think they are probably looking at us to talk about performance. But probably what I see our role as consultants or advisor is that probably we need to be more aware of the risk and make the investors aware rather than really talking about performance alone. What could be some of those risks, probably that one needs to look out for, and how do we play the market in that scenario?
Sure. I think there are two risks that we run, and I think the first risk is more fundamental. That I think we as a nation and we as a government don't basically stand up to the challenge, don't stand up to the crisis, and do not do things which are required to be done in a crisis situation. So how do we as a nation and as a government convert this crisis into an opportunity? And I think there are some indications of the government doing things, but a lot more needs to be done. There seems to be an intent, there seems to be a determination, but obviously all of us need to see more action, and we definitely need to see more execution. So I think the big risk for India is basically that how do different constituents of the government, be the central government, state governments, policy makers, and all of that come together and look at this challenge or a crisis in a more collective fashion and basically rise up to the challenge. So that I think is basically the most important risk that I think we face as a nation and as investors. Number one. Number two risk, which I think, Ram, which is I think very useful for, which I think is very relevant for me as a portfolio manager, which is very relevant for you as an advisor. And third is for our investors as asset allocators. Is basically the time itself could be a risk. I think my own observation has been that, Ram, that over a period of time, I think I find investors to be a lot more patient with their non-equity investments. So I always find a patient as an investor to be very patient when he's investing into real estate. I find him to be very patient when he's investing into private equity. I find him to be very patient when he's investing into startups. I find him very patient when he's investing into fixed income. But I find investors to be a lot more edgy when it comes to equities. Unfortunately, there is the ticker, there is CNBC and all of that. There is basically those broking terminals, there are prices, there is daily NAV and all of that, but I think that this is honestly the risk that I may think, Ram, that beyond 2020 things are going to be better. But this is a market which is not going to dance to the tunes of you and me. This is a market where the recovery could be a little more long drawn, and we keep talking of alphabets B and W and U and L and whatnot and all of that. And you could see these moves. We've seen Nifty 7,500 or 10,500. We may go to 12,000, come back to 9,000, etc., all of that. And this could be also a part of a very long-term base building process. So I think that the second big risk is basically going to be time, that this could take a bit longer than what you, me and our investors may think or envisage or contemplate. So we will have to make the market and the time as our friend rather than kind of be impatient with it. So I think that is the second risk that we face, that that the slowdown or the recession actually takes a lot longer, because most of the recessions in our living memory have lasted for 2 to 4 quarters. But could this last for 5 quarters, 6 quarters? Who knows? It may. Okay, and we, I think, as investors have to be cognizant that this could very well play out. So the best way to address is to really not have any expectations for 2020, 2021. I think that is, a great thing if we all, as me as a portfolio manager, you as an asset allocator or as an advisor, and our investors, okay, as actually the ultimate allocators, think of this as basically a period which is going to be basically a 2+ or a 3+ kind of a period, rather than how our portfolios are going to behave or equity allocations are going to behave over the next 2 months or 2 weeks or 2 quarters or 2 years.
Sure, Nilesh. I think that's summed up quite well. In fact, that could be as well the closing remarks as well, because I think what Nilesh has summarized essentially is that while we are looking at equity as our wealth creation vehicle, we also need to be cognizant of the risk and also learn to be patient, like he said, with it when we have put money into it, and not really get into equities as a tool for quick money making kind of a tool. So Anita, would you like to add something? Because I think we are pretty much done with our session today.
Oh, I think you're very good. Yeah. So just that last thing about PSU sectors.
So there is one more question. Okay.
On a lighter note, I think Prakash and Jagdish are pretty much planning a portfolio for everybody with the type of questions they're asking. So thank you so much for your participation, guys. So, Nilesh, last question for the day. What's your take on how are PSU sectors like BHEL, BEL to be looked at? And then I think
Okay. So Anita, I think the PSUs have fallen off, and from the conventional prism of value investing, I think they could actually be reasonable candidates to kind of make money. But from basically the normal framework that I would basically look at or evaluate companies, essentially, here is essentially the owner of these PSUs who's perennially going to be wanting to sell these companies. So if they basically keep selling in small chunks, that does act as an overhang, number one. Number two, the lack of managerial autonomy. There is really no incentive for the top management of these PSUs to excel. Okay. Their bosses are essentially the bureaucrats, and where essentially is the alignment of interest. So that essentially is one thing. Third is that majority of the PSUs over a period of time have converted themselves from being leaders to laggards. Okay, you look at an MTNL, and and there are umpteen examples. I don't need to kind of get into it. So that will always remain a challenge. Now, they've become classic value bets that they are trading from 10p, they've come down to 5p, so you buy them at 5p, and then one day they'll go back to a 7-8p, and therefore you sell them off and all of them. So I'd probably say that if you are willing to make a tactical allocation in your portfolio, if you are not basically the classic growth investor who's out there looking for capital efficient businesses, but are willing to make a tactical allocation or an allocation towards beaten down stuff, then maybe the PSUs will qualify.
Sure, Nilesh. So I think yes, Nilesh. So thanks a lot. Thank you for this wonderful session. Actually, I need to thank Chaital from Nilesh's team, who has worked behind the scenes. I mean, though he's there, but he's not seen. But definitely, he has worked behind the scenes and made this session possible. And I think so. And thanks to all participants for their questions and for being here on a weekend that is actually the first weekend of the unlocking of things. So I think as people have been saying that, Ram, you may have got lucky with your webinars having participants while the lockdown was there, but now with unlocking happening, we don't know how that will pan out. But then again, that's an outlook for me to have. So thanks again, Nilesh, for this wonderful session. I think we hope to probably have you sooner or later again on our platform. And meanwhile, yes, like I said, Nilesh does run a portfolio management service, and he has built an excellent track record for himself and for the investors over the last decade. And we obviously would love to look forward to working with you, Nilesh, right? So with that, I think we would like to wrap it up. Thanks to you again, and thanks to Chaital, and thanks to all the participants for being there today for the call.
Thank
Thank you, Ram. Thank you so much, Ram. Thank you, Nilesh. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you, Anita.
Thank you, Chaital.
Great
Just one
session.
request, Nilesh, I think to all the participants out there, as Moneystream, as Envision, we really would like to stay on with your memories. So do watch our space, follow us on all our handles, and you'll keep hearing helpful tips which will help you take the right calls, right? So thank you so much for doing that. Thank you, Nilesh.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Anita. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you very much.